As many around the world now recognize, climate change has been caused mostly by industrialized countries who have emitted as much as 75% of all greenhouse gases now in the atmosphere. And yet, it is developing countries that will suffer the most from its projected impacts. Focus on the Global South is presenting this report in the hope of shedding light on and making people better informed participants of this debate. We hope to help spark a wider public conversation about this little-known, highly technical, but very lucrative scheme called the Clean Development Mechanism. Though obscure, this scheme is at the heart of the only international agreement on climate change that the world has so far succeeded in adopting, as Joseph mentioned. And it is rapidly growing. The carbon market, of which the CDM is a part, is now the world's fastest growing commodities market. And it is set to displace credit derivatives as the world's largest derivative market by some projections. Here in the Philippines, it is already estimated to bring in between 13 billion and 40 billion pesos to date. This is as of June 2009. The CDM is essentially a market mechanism for trading a new and increasingly valuable commodity, the right to emit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. What the CDM in effect does is to allow those who want more of this asset, the right to emit, to buy it from companies in developing countries. Each CDM credit represents a payment made by a corporation in a rich country for a poor country not to use the limited resource so that the rich country can use that resource for itself. Even in theory then, the CDM does not intend to achieve reductions beyond those that developed countries should already achieve under the Kyoto Protocol. So even if it worked perfectly well according to the theory, CDM projects in the Philippines will not result in net emissions reductions on their own, because every reductions here in the Philippines is intended to be offset by an increase in emissions in an industrialized country. That's what the theory says. In practice, it may even be worse. As we try to argue in the report, there are good reasons to doubt whether the CDM projects are actually leading to emissions reductions on their own. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because it means that the CDM may actually be increasing overall emissions. That means that it may not actually be helping us solve the climate change problem. In fact, as I will try to argue later, it may even be undermining the real solutions. How can this happen? Let us review the scheme, the premise of the scheme. The CDM allows developed countries to exceed their emissions limitations under the Kyoto Protocol as long as those emissions are offset by reductions in emissions in developing countries. But if the reductions in developing countries are questionable or fraudulent, then this means that the net effect is really a net increase in emissions. First, we found that the CDM is subsidizing many of the very practices that need to be discouraged, if not stopped, to reduce overall emissions in the Philippines. Environmentalists and proponents of sustainable agriculture and development have been campaigning against the negative environmental impacts of landfilling and factory farming for years. And yet, these are precisely the kind of practices which the CDM is infusing with billions of pesos in support. Second, we found, by following the money trail, that most of the CDM funds will actually go to some of the richest families who own some of the largest conglomerates in the Philippines, with stakes in such high carbon-emitting businesses as large-scale open-pit mining, coal and diesel power generation, and other extractive fossil fuel-intensive industries. A number of them have actually been cited for pollution violations by the government, as you will see in the table. So, instead of siding with the communities and organizations protecting nature from these disruptive activities, the CDM is instead providing additional cash flows to the Zamoras, the Lopezes, the Aboitises, the Tans, etc., who in turn are expanding their mines and building even more coal power plants in the country. Finally, we found that by making government inaction financially rewarding, The CDM may be undermining the government's own ability to enforce environmental laws. It is providing disincentives against improved environmental regulation. So let me just summarize why our research found the CDM projects in the Philippines to be costly, dirty, money-making schemes. They're costly in many ways. 13 billion to 40 billion pesos is a lot of money for achieving reductions in emissions that could be achieved more cheaply. Waste segregation, recycling, and composting can reduce more emissions for a fraction of what the Zamoras are earning from the project. But they're also costly because they allow rich countries to subvert their emissions limitations. They're costly because they distract us from the real solutions to the climate problem. They're costly because they put the lives of all those who will be affected by climate change in great danger. They're dirty because they support the very environmentally destructive practices that should be stopped to avert climate change. And they're dirty because money goes to the very giant conglomerates expanding fossil fuel use and extraction in the country. They're money-making schemes because instead of promoting genuine, long-term, and cheaper but effective solutions to our environmental problems, their main consideration is to generate quick, short-term profits for private companies and revenues for the government.